You look like you're in fantastic shape, man. Like, what kind of exercise program are you on?
Oh man, I run back and forth to the refrigerator about 4 or 5 times a day.
All right, welcome back to the world's #1 pro wrestling broadcast, Monte The Pharaoh, where we're welcoming the great Brian Adias.
There he is.
We grew up WWF fans, right?
True.
But obviously, once cable came and WCCW entered our television,
He was done.
Right, you were one of those top stars that we loved. But the one thing that always confused me is I always called you Brian Adias, like the shoe. I always recognized it like that. Was that your wrestling name, or was it Adios?
It's Adias, and we started out. I'll tell you a funny story. I grew up with Kerry Von Erich. We started first grade together, went all the way to 12th grade. So I spent a ton of time over Kerry's and his dad Fritz Von Erich's house. And when I decided to come in the wrestling business, we were sitting in there talking to Fritz in his office, and I had my foot up, and he looked over at it and he said Adias, Brian Adias. And so we went with that. And when the cable we went nationwide and worldwide, Adidas Corporation actually sent a letter to the Sportatorium and asked me to change the spelling of my name, or change my name, and I didn't want to, so I just took one of the D's out and made it Adias. And then after I'd been in a couple of years, they came back and said, "Hey, we want to sponsor you now." So they changed the tune after they saw how strong the world-class wrestling show was and everything. And I said, "Nah, I've kept it like this for long enough now. I'll just keep it, So, but that's a true story.
Did Fritz get mad at you? Like, Fritz didn't want to turn down that kind of advertising, right?
Or did he?
Well, Fritz didn't have anything to do with it. They contacted me. Not
they went straight to. Okay. Very cool.
Yeah. And you didn't tell Kerry, because Kerry would tell Fritz.
Well, I was over there. I mean, I practically going over to their house. They had a place out in the country, about 157 acres. It was like to me, man, I grew up a middle class kid. We didn't have a ton of money. Never went without anything, but going over to their house was like going to Disneyland. They swimming pools, motorcycles. We hunt and fish just constantly growing up. So Kerry and I our main thing where we did bird hunting, did quail, dove, and duck, and we took over basically all the getting the eggs from the quail and the dove, and putting them in incubators and stuff like that, feeding the ducks before duck season, and getting all the hunting ready. And Fritz really liked that because he didn't have to do it.
Very cool. You grew up with Kerry, like you said. Seems like you guys ran down the same roads, kind of doing the same sports. Obviously, Kerry was hitting the gas pretty hard. Were you involved in hitting the gas at all back at that age, or did you stay completely natural?
I stayed natural. I did a little bit of stuff in college with the shot put because they had to be so strong, but I never stayed on anything for any period of time, because I knew that's short lived. Man, you hit the sauce that much, it's going to affect your body. And now then, I'm 63 years old, man. I just had my heart checked out, and the guy that had did the sound. What is that called?
Ultrasound.
yeah, cardiograms and all that.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm in perfect shape. They said, "Man, you're like you're 30 years old." So I'm glad I didn't do the roids and stuff and stay on them heavy. That's me right there. I was like, that was like three years ago. That's
Wow.
Wow.
when I was
Damn.
60.
Yeah.
Incredible.
After further review, I want to be your age if I'm going to look like that.
That's good.
Wow.
After further
Damn,
review.
Brian. Brian, I got to ask you, though. I mean, growing up with Kerry, and obviously you guys were best buds, and you see Kerry ballooning into a statue. Did you try to tell him, like, bro, this might not be the best thing. You look great, but this might be bad for you?
Well, here's the thing that a lot of people, I know y'all probably know a little bit about it too. Kerry trained harder than anybody I've ever seen. You can't just do some roids and be big. He
Right.
trained harder than any professional bodybuilder that I've ever seen. He was a workhorse, man. So, and he didn't do them all the time. You got to realize where he
Okay.
came from. Fritz
Okay.
von Erich, when he was younger, he was a mountain of a man
was.
too. So his genetics,
He was.
as far as he just trained harder than the rest of the brothers did. And
Right.
it wasn't all roids. Kerry trained super hard to get that body. It
That's
just
actually
didn't. You just
that's
don't
actually really good to
do
know.
some roids
That's
and look
cool.
like that.
Yeah.
That's
yeah,
a lot of
because
work.
he might have had the greatest physique we've ever seen, right, Mike? I mean, Kerry Von Erich, you absolutely love. I know that
Yeah.
much, but he might have had the greatest physique we've ever seen in a wrestling ring. Very close, if not the best.
So Brian, hanging out at the Von Erich house, like you said, it was like Disneyland. Was there any jealousy on your part, being around that family all the time?
Absolutely not. They basically. I was like one of their brothers. I mean, when I graduated high school, I still have it. Fritz wrote on his letterhead. He said to Brian, he said, "Our sixth son." So, and then he wrote me a deal saying how he really enjoyed seeing how I came around with the training and the shot put and gotten to be a great athlete. And he had a lot of respect for me, and I had a lot of respect for them. But I was never jealous of Kerry and them. I mean, I just never had any. It just didn't happen.
You mentioned Fritz. What was your relationship like with Fritz? And the second part of the question would be, many people from that organization felt that Fritz pushed the boys too hard. Is that something that you feel?
I think more than pushing them, I think he had high expectations from them, but I don't think standing behind them like some people portray, with a whip pushing people on. I think the brothers, being Kerry, David, and Kevin, I think they pushed themselves more than Fritz pushed them because they wanted to live up, to the expectations, and they all were hard workers, man. You know what I mean? Kevin and David both went to North Texas. Kevin played football, David played football and basketball, but then they started wrestling. Why wouldn't you? They didn't play all 4 years, but making all that money stepping in to wrestling, why wouldn't you? But my relationship with Fritz was great. I just he always treated me really, really good. So he I was over there at their house when I was 6 years old. So he basically watched me grow up. Fritz and Doris were really good friends with my parents. Lake Dallas only had 1,000 people. It's 40 people in my graduating class, so it was a small, small town. But I have nothing but respect, and Fritz was never You know, he was never mean to me or anything like that, or, you know, like a lot of people portray. He could be gruff. Don't get me wrong. You know, he was a captain of a tight ship. You know, he's old school, but he saw the dedication and the work that I was putting in to making myself a better person and athlete. And his boys, we all worked hard. So to answer your question, I think with the boys, Fritz pushing them, I think they pushed themselves harder than Fritz pushed them.
So let's go back to the time where you decide you want to become a pro wrestler. What's that conversation like with your parents?
Well, you know, I went all 4 years at UTA and I got my degree in finance. I promised my mom that I would get my degree, you know, because when Kerry left the University of Houston after his freshman year, he was just on me constantly. You got to come into wrestling. You got to come into wrestling. So I said, I will, but I promised myself and my mom that I was going to get my degree and stay 4 years. And I started actually between my sophomore and junior year at UTA. And when I was enrolled in college, you couldn't back then, the NCAA, you couldn't be pro and get paid. So the only time I wrestled until I graduated in 1982 was in the summer. And I wrestled in the summer of 80 and 81, and then I went full-time in 82 when I graduated college.
WCCW goes national. At this point, with that roster, when WCCW went national, did you think they were going to take over the world? Because the talent level that was going on in Texas was absurd. And did you think at the time that you could take over the country, the world, beat out the Vince McMahon East Coast stuff? I mean, what were your thoughts when it went national?
Well, I think in the beginning, I was young and didn't really think a lot about it, but I'll never forget it. Fritz brought me and Kerry into his office at their house one day, and he said, "I'm about to make a big move. We're gonna break away from the NWA, and we're gonna be world-class championship wrestling. And there's this thing called cable TV." And me and Kerry kind of looked around like, you know, what's that? And he already knew. He knew what time it was and what was going to happen. And he was a smart man. He was a businessman to the core, man. He was extremely intelligent when it come to business. And to answer your question, no, I didn't realize how big it was going to be. I don't think anybody did. You know, when you're in your infancy, you know, on a business or whatever you're going for. But as it went on, I really saw. You know, I went to New York in 2018 for a get together up there, and I bet I had at least 1,000 people come up to me that weekend and say, "Man, I loved World Class Wrestling on ESPN." He said, "Y'all's show and wrestling was head and shoulders above everything else. The way it was produced, the talent, and all that." And looking back, I was really honored to be a part of it, and still am. So I have people all the time still talking about World Class Wrestling.
So, Brian, your first heel turn is against Mike Von Erich, who recently, at that point, just gets out of the hospital. The question to you is, what kind of pressure were you under? I mean, that's a big deal, right? The guy was certainly fragile. I'm sure Fritz put you in that spot because he trusted you, but what kind of stress was that for you as being his opponent?
Well, you know, I think Fritz and I kind of came up with the idea at the same time, you know, for me turning heel. You were never going to be above the Von Erichs as a babyface here in World Class. And Kerry had his motorcycle wreck and had hurt his foot. He was out. And they needed somebody, and it just made sense. I came up, everybody knew I was their friend, and what's the worst thing that could ever happen is having your friend turn on you, and then turning on Mike. Answer your question, yes. He knew he could trust me, that I was not going to eat Mike up, and I always made him look really good, and put him over just like a $1,000,000. But nobody ever beat Mike 1, 2, 3 in the middle of the ring except me. When I did my heel turn, that was the only time Mike Von Erich got pinned 1, 2, 3 in the ring. I mean, he worked with Flair and everybody else, and nobody ever beat him. They'd go Broadway or something. But when I saw that Fritz was willing to do that and put me in that position, I knew I was carrying a big load on my shoulders as far as being a heel. And when I turned heel, I had to watch out what I was doing around here in Dallas, because people, they idolized the Von Erichs, and people wanted to kick my ass and beat me up every time I went somewhere, so I was carrying a pistol when I turned heel, for good reason. I had people wanting to just get me constantly.
On a personal level, though, and you would know, did you think Mike should have been in the ring after all that? Do you, as fans, you heard he was never the same after that toxic syndrome. Did you personally feel that they shouldn't have put him back in the ring?
Well, there's a fine line there. Kerry had got hurt. David had passed away. So Mike was kind of thrust into that position. But personally, I love Mike to death. He was just a sweetheart of a guy. I really don't think he ever should have been in wrestling, if the truth be known, because he just wasn't cut out for it. Really, he had a bunch of guitars. He wanted to play music and play rock and roll. So his mind wasn't really into it, and his everything. But after he got the toxic shock and came back, he was different. He had a different look in his eye. But, I had in wrestling, I had a job to do. So me calling the shots, whether he should have been there or not, I was just, I was part of the program and doing what I was asked to do and draw money. And that's what we did, but I don't think Mike's heart was ever into wrestling, and he probably could have been better served doing something else.
When you mentioned David before, when the family lost David, and I consider you part of the family, what was that like? And then when Mike took his life, how was that situation? Were they too different, or did you have the same feeling?
I was devastated when David passed away. He was in Japan. He's on a trip in Japan. David and I were close too. We traveled a lot together before, when I first started, and before I went to Oregon. But David and I, and Kevin too. I mean, we were just we were close. It's about as close as you can get. But it was devastating with David because it was so unexpected. I remember I was in Mid-South working for Bill Watts, and he called me at my apartment there and told me about David, and they wanted Fritz and everybody wanted me to come back. I actually got on a plane that day. It was Friday, which we wrestled at the Sportatorium on Friday nights, and I flew back to Dallas and took Kerry's place in a tag team that night. But it was a somber event, man. When I flew back, I went straight over to their house, and man, it was terrible. It was devastating. But I buried 4 of them in 9 years. I buried David in 84. I buried Mike in 87. I buried Chris in 91. And I buried my best friend, Kerry, in 93. Kerry was a biggest shock, because I had trouble believing it. And David being the first one, being an untimely death, was probably the most shocking, but it kind of shocked me too. It didn't shock me with Mike and Chris, but it shocked me with Kerry, for him, because he was such larger than life individual. It was, he just felt like he didn't have anything to offer anymore, that life didn't have anything to offer. But I buried 4 of those guys, 4 of my good friends, in 9 years. It's tough.
Did you? It's not easy to ask, but I'll give it a shot. Were you ever angry at the way some of them passed away, obviously? I mean, did you ever get angry about it? Like, what the...
I don't know if anger is the right way to put it. Suicide, you don't ever know what's going on in somebody's head. I found that out with Kerry, because I was with Kerry the day before he committed suicide. But to answer your question, I don't think I was ever angry. I guess I was, like your mom used to tell you, I'm not mad at you, I'm just disappointed.
Okay.
I was disappointed that they took their life. And, Kerry had 2 girls that were 6 and 8 years old, and they just idolized him. And he loved, Holly and Lacey. I mean, like, that was their world, the girls and him. He loved those girls. And it was, I guess I was a little bit, I guess you could say, angry with Kerry that leaving those 2 girls behind than I was of him taking his own life.
But you did say you weren't so shocked about Chris and Mike. Why was that?
They were just, I think both of them spent their life trying to measure up. And I think they always felt like they might not have measured up, and they weren't good enough or something like that. And,
Pressure.
Let's bring it back to one of the great angles of all time in wrestling is when you and Kerry have your fallout. Kind of going back to what we spoke about Mike, how much stress were you up against, since Kerry had just come off the motorcycle accident? I'm assuming you knew he had lost his foot, or did you not? What kind of stress were you under for that angle?
Oh, I knew. I went to the emergency room when Kerry had the motorcycle wreck, and I was there when they did 14 hours of surgery, and the next morning they were, after the surgery, I was there with Fritz and them, and the doctor said, there's just too much damage. We're not going to be able to save his foot. And, Fritz was asking them, are you sure? And they said, yeah, there's just not enough of the bone and stuff left from his ankle down to his toes. It was just mangled, man. He was wearing shorts and a flip-flops when he had the motorcycle wreck. So it basically just ground his foot off on the asphalt.
God.
But the stress of it, when Kerry had the surgery, he started training back on his upper body and stuff. He never quit working out when he was off for 18 months with his foot. He was getting ready. He was ready for the day he came back to wrestle, and he and I wrestled at Reunion Arena and sold it out.
Because I wouldn't forgive myself if I didn't ask you, since you knew the Von Erich family so well. I always felt that David was destined for great, great things, and I feel that he was the greatest of the Von Erichs. I mean, ultimately, Kerry is probably the most famous of them, but I feel like David was cut short. Was David headed for serious world championship aspirations? Because I felt he had the real total package as a professional wrestling product. Any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. Everybody will tell you David was the best worker by far. David understood the business, the psychology of the business. He was going to take over world class. He was going to step into Fritz's place, because David had a business head on his shoulders and understood the business really, really well. And that really changed him. Passing away changed the course of what happened with world class tremendously. So, yeah, David was the worker. I watched David work. He could work, man, and he had the business sense, and not that Kerry and Kevin didn't, but he was the one that was going to take it over and run it.
Tell us about the Freebirds. And how is Michael Hayes? Is he full of himself? Because he really ruined this poor guy when he ran into him in an airport. How was Michael Hayes in the Freebirds?
Michael, lived his gimmick, which really, if you don't live your gimmick, you're selling yourself short. So
I agree.
Every professional wrestler has to have a bit of being full of himself.
Yep.
Because if you can't separate your personal life and your business life, you're basically a product. And the way you market yourself, the way a corporation would market a product, you're selling yourself short. I acted completely different on TV as Brian Adias as I did people. I've always had everybody that's ever met me say, man, you're one of the most intelligent, nice and, guys I've ever met, because I can't go out and, talk to people and, be Brian Adias all the time. So when people met me, I wanted to be impressive as a human being, and not be all that. But when I was at a wrestling arena or something, I was certainly in character, and you have to be. But yeah, Michael had a strong, personality, and he lived the business. He's done well for himself. He's up in WWF, Vince's office, and one of his right-hand guys. So he's done something right, man. So Michael's a smart guy too. So Michael and I always got along good. I had a lot of respect for him, and Terry and Buddy. They were the Freebird Von Erich feud is still talked about today, and it was huge.
In your opinion, we've seen since the Freebirds, we've seen the NWO, we've seen D-Generation X. Are the Freebirds the greatest faction in the history of pro wrestling in your mind? Just curious.
You know what? I think basically they are. They were doing their deal before any of that other stuff happened. Mm-hmm. So they were innovators in a respect. Having those three guys were the best three guys of a combination of different type of wrestlers that you could possibly have. Michael was the guy that could talk, yep, and the flashy. Gordy was the worker, and he could talk, do interviews. Buddy was the fall guy, but they were innovators. They come up with those gimmicks, and they were the very first people to do all that. I think that's why that Von Erich Freebird feud is one of the best angles ever, because Dallas wrestling, we got after it down here, man. We didn't, it wasn't a bunch of theatrics. We laid them in, and we worked hard, and it was physical.